Okay. Anyway, for those of you who are here, this is supposed to be science fiction as epic. Otherwise, you're in the wrong room. If at any point somebody cannot hear me, let me know. I will talk louder. I do a podcast, so I'm used to screaming. Okay, I'm used to being screamed at, so that's a different conversation. I am Declan Finn, the moderator. I think I'm here because I'm a fanboy. I've written epic science fiction. I just haven't published it yet because I keep hitting it with a hammer. Though I am the author of several other things, but I'm not the interesting one here. If the folks on our panel could introduce if you could introduce yourselves with an emphasis on, well, your epic science fiction creds.
You want me to start over here?
Sure.
Yep.
Epic science fiction creds, I do not have a lot of right now. I have a short fiction piece that's coming out. I have several other works that I'm doing. I always have about 3 or 4 different novels going at once, which explains all the crazy voices in my head, or at least slightly. So that tends to be my aspect right now. The most recent book that I have out is actually epic fantasy, and it is Icebergs. But I'm going to be part of an anthology that's coming out this summer that is one of Chris Kennedy's babies. And then I have a few other military science fiction works that I'm doing right now that I tend to build into series, so I'm pretty sure that's the direction it's going no matter what.
My name is Jack McDevitt, and I always claim that everything I write is epical. But the one I can think of immediately that probably fits the general description is a book called Moonfall, in which there's an accident of sorts, and a large asteroid hits the moon, and we get a certain amount of raining rocks on the planet. There's a major effort out to try to save us ourselves. I'll let it go with that.
I'm Nancy Northcott. I have never written epic science fiction or epic fantasy, but I read them by the boatloads, and so that's why I'm sitting here. I just launched a historical fantasy trilogy, The Board King's Honor, with a Richard III theme. This is Restoration England, and then it'll go up through the Battle of Britain. I also write paranormal romance for Hachette, and taking my first foray into space opera with a friend this summer, because I read a lot of that too, and so does she, and we thought, well, we've been reading this for years, we should see if we can write it. So, and I have sample chapters I can go on.
I'm Steve White. So far I've had 22 science fiction novels published. I'm best known for the Starfire series, which I have co-authored first with David Weber, and more recently with our guest of honor, Chuck Gannon. I suppose these would have to be considered epic. At least they have a large interstellar scale, and typically they have a body count that can only be comfortably expressed in powers of 10. I'm also working in a time travel series, which I've been writing solo. This is up to novel number 6 now. This is the Jason Thanos series. This involves a series of very high-stakes time wars. And I've written one and only one fantasy that I admit is a fantasy. A good deal of my science fiction is thinly disguised fantasy, but I've actually written one high fantasy entitled Demon's Gate. This is set in a fantasy world that bears the same relation to Bronze Age Europe that your typical high fantasy bears to the High Middle Ages. And here again, if nothing else, it's high stakes. I don't know if this is part of the definition of epic or not.
Well, we can have that discussion next. Anyway, as I said, I'm Declan Finn. I am the author of the Love at First Bite series, which is either urban fantasy, horror, or paranormal romance, depending on who you ask. I'm also the author of the Pious Trilogy, coming from Silver Empire Press. It's called a trilogy, but it's got 5 books in it. Don't ask, it's a long story.
It's related to Robert Jordan.
When I have his sale numbers, then we'll talk. So, let's actually start with Steve's comment. How would you What would you say are the qualities that separate something out as epic? Is it scope? Is it has 100 characters that you want to?
I don't think it has to have that many major characters. At least I sincerely hope not, because I get confused too easily. But I think what it really boils down to a great extent, is an epic scale. And this is why I think science fiction lends itself to it, because in science fiction we can get away with a really epic scale. I mean, the galaxy, for heaven's sake. And one thing that bothers me, now, I've written a lot of military science fiction, as I said, the Starfire series, and one thing that bothers me about a lot of present-day military SF is that I think the authors are thinking small. They don't avail themselves of their opportunities for for an epic scale. It started to strike me back in the late 60s and early 70s. Typically, the military science fiction I would read, what it boiled down to was one grubby little infantry squad stuck in the jungle on planet Vietnam. And, so I got turned off on this, and for a long time I didn't read any. But after a while I decided, well, it's been quite a number of years, so recently, and I'm not going to name any names, but recently I picked up a work of military science fiction, and sure enough, we had one grubby little infantry squad stuck in the desert in planet Afghanistan. Now, don't get me wrong, there is nothing wrong with fiction like this. I just think it's unnecessarily self-limiting in the science fiction field, because in science fiction, we can have an epic scale. The sky is the limit, literally as well as figuratively. Of course, we have to go into interstellar space now to do it, now that the space probes have ruined the solar system. But we can still do it. All we have to do is, we are only limited by our own assumptions that we're making about the future technology.
I would tend to agree with what Steve said with regard to scope, because to me, an epic story is a story with big stakes and a wide-ranging story. So if I were to write a story just set here on Earth, even if it took me a trilogy or 5 books to do it, if it didn't have really big stakes, and not a squad stuck in planet Afghanistan, but if it's just like in a couple of cities, maybe one city in every country, I wouldn't call that epic. It would be an interesting story. It could be a fairly big story, but I think it doesn't make the jump to epic.
I was thinking about that coming in here today, trying to decide in my own head. I'm not sure whose else's head I would use. Trying to decide what epic really means, and it is certainly clear. You're talking. I think more than anything else, you're talking about stakes. What's at stake here? You can't have you don't really have epic mystery stories, for example, where who shot Uncle Harry. Those don't make it as epics. So there's a lot at stake, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be the whole world or a whole city. If you have characters that are really seriously involve the reader, and there's a group of people that maybe they're trying to help blind people, for example, and try to find, and it's very difficult to handle it, and a crisis is coming, that can become epical. If it's got Henry James or somebody to write the thing, that's not easy for most of us, but that'll work. Epic is a very tough thing to try to define, because it works in different ways for different writers, and that's basically what it's about. I think we're probably all in agreement on the military SF, which is that if you're doing military SF, you have to, which is I think really at the heart maybe of this conversation, you have to do more than simply decide that we win the battle, that the good guys win the battle. There's got to be more at stake than that. The Star Wars thing, I'm not sure. So Star Wars are the 3 films that work, which is the original 3. That's an epical story. I'm not sure why. Maybe it has to do with the character, some of the characters that are involved. But you really get involved and tangled, and there is a sense that there's a great deal at stake. the way that they go. So they went for it, and I think they got it.
And there's the mythic resonance to it,
Right.
a great deal of that. I think that's an important element.
Well, I think honestly, and this might just be the English teacher in me coming out right away, but a lot of what an epic really is classified under would be the idea of the hero's epic. You know, Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero's epic is that outline. You know, so what is considered the classical epic is always going to follow those same steps. But when we start to shift into science fiction or even mixed genre fiction, then that epic gets a little broader. You know, it starts to change and morph. It still follows the same formulaic pattern, like a recipe, but it starts to become something else, something that's a little more relatable to a modern ideal of what the universe could be. So science fiction kind of stretches that. You know, with the original Star Wars movies, it still followed Campbell's idea of what the hero's epic was, but it started to push against those boundaries a little bit because we've always considered the hero's epic in the classical literature sense, and that's not what it is anymore. So I think, you know, defining the epic as just one thing, it's not that anymore. It follows some of that same pattern, but it has branched out so much, so I'm not sure we can just put it in a box.
Okay. What do you see as some of the better epic science fiction out there? Pick any media, pick any time period you like. I'm not going to try limiting it. You want to start, Charity?
Sure. Dune immediately comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
It has that classical sense to it, but I also think that a more modern aspect is some of what Weber has done, some of the Flint has a little bit of the epic qualities in it, but and that's part of why it's such a morphing idea. You know, they can approach it in so many different ways.
I'm kind of cool for the limb here. There's a Star Trek episode that I love, and I'm not sure whether it's an epic or not. I'd probably have to argue to make it into an epic, but it has some characteristics of it. And it is the one in which Kirk and the crew of the Enterprise meet, I think it's Apollo, somewhere out there.
Who mourns for Adonis?
And I remember thinking when I saw the movie, and what made it epical for me was when I saw the film, I thought what they were really talking about was not Apollo, but the God of the Old Testament. But they didn't want to go that far and say that. But that was kind of the way I read the thing. We don't need you anymore. And that was what made it epical for me, even though it was a fairly short, it's a 1 hour show.
Mm-hmm.
But somehow it was there.
One of my longtime favorites is Gordon R. Dixon's Dorsai and Child Cycle books, because they're wide in scope and they move toward a big idea of the ultimate evolution of humanity, integrating the courage of the Dorsai, the philosophy of the exotics, and the faith of, the exotics are the faith and the friendlies are the philosophers, or something like that. But anyway, the integration of the three. And the story takes place over a long period of time, and it moves around the galaxy. There are not a lot of planets destroyed, but it is a big idea story and a big scope story, and it really bothers me that because Gordon R. Dixon died, Hal Mayne is going to be stuck on the final encyclopedia awaiting the great confrontation, forever.
Okay, my capacity for tasteless self-promotion has limits, so I won't mention the Starfire series. However, I completely agree. Dave Weber's stuff certainly qualifies. Now, I'm sure I'm going to get shamed for this, but I'm going to mention Doc Smith. Everybody loves to demonstrate his cultural superiority by sneering at Doc Smith. But damn it, the man thought big. He conceived an all-around story, which was of epic proportions, and he gave it the telling it deserved. nobody is going to say the man was a great prose stylist or a master of characterization, but he did think big. Now, among present-day writers, I would like to mention Ian Douglas, which is a pseudonym for William H. Keith. This guy has cranked out a quantity of military science fiction which rivals Dave Weber. I wouldn't even guess which of them has turned out the most numbers of millions of words. But this guy does not think small. This has a scope that's not only transgalactic, but transtemporal and the whole multi-universe. And what's at stake here? You talk about high stakes. The human race, and frankly, I think he's overestimating a lot of future technological potential in areas like nanotech and AI. He's assuming the most optimistic possible assumptions anybody has made about these, and so as a result, in the 25th century, the human race is nearing a technological transcendence. Excuse me. And there is a long established galactic empire is the wrong word, but galactic intelligence, which has uploaded itself into AIs, which cannot tolerate this, therefore it cannot tolerate the human race. You talk about high stakes. I don't see how they could be made any higher than this. So I would, as I say, I don't buy everything the guy projects about future technology, but conditionally I would recommend these books. He actually has a couple of series going. Star Carrier is one series, and he has another one, Star Corpsman. And that's one other point I should mention about him.
The Marines.
Yeah, that's the way. Yeah, this is one other thing I should mention about him. Despite this staggering scale, he does bring it down to the human level. The grunts in the trenches. Dave Weber has been criticized. I think it was John Ringo who said this, that all his characters are officers, and most of them are flag officers. You can't say this, Douglas.
Yes. For television, at least, I would definitely put in Babylon 5 in that particular category of epic science fiction. I would actually include some of John Ringo's books, if only because if the first book isn't epic, wait a book or two, it'll get there before he starts blowing up yet another planet. Okay.
Hey, planet here, planet there.
We got plenty of us here.
Yeah.
After a while, you're talking about serious problems.
Now, there are some who use the term space opera as a derogatory term, kind of like soap opera, implying it's crass, the characters are shallow, something along those lines. And, as Steve mentioned, one of the examples given about space opera has been Doc Smith of the Lensman novels, or even John W. Campbell. Yet I have also heard the term used to describe Babylon 5, David Weber novels, both of which have characters, deep motivations, backstories, and some biographies. What is your opinion on the term space opera? Is it accurate? Is it derogatory?
Science fiction has been defined as fantasy for rationalists. Space opera could be defined as science fiction on steroids. Basically, as you say, the cultural meaning of space opera seems to be anything a given book reviewer doesn't like. But I think the genre is underrated. I think there is such a thing as thinking person's space opera. This is what I try to write. I know it's what Dave Weber tries to write. And it would be hard, I'm kind of hard-pressed to define thinking person's space opera as opposed to the other kind of space opera. But one aspect of it, I think, would be internal consistency. The author, in order to have this sort of thing, one has to make some pretty bold assumptions about future technology, such as Dave Weber does, but he needs to be self-consistent about it. He can't just get his characters out of a tight spot by supercharging the duotronic Kubatzer. He has to establish the capabilities of his future technology and stick to them. This is what Larry Niven did in his known space series, except that as he continued to write it, he continued to develop the technology until he had written himself into a corner. So you have to avoid that. But I think what you need to do, well, here's one part of the definition of space opera. There is its approach to future technology. There are two approaches you can use in science fiction. One is you assume that such and such capability is developed in the future, such and such thing is invented, and then you follow this assumption wherever it takes you. You know, what would a duotronic Kubatzer using society look like? What kind of dramatic conflicts can be caused or gotten out of by the use of duotronic Kubatzers, and so forth. The other approach, which is equally valid, and Dave Weber is the classic example of it, reverses this. You know what you want, so you have to decide what technological assumptions you have to make in order for it to make sense. Dave knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted, for the Honor Harrington series, he wanted Nelson's Navy among the stars. So what kind of assumptions do you have to make for that to make sense? So he invented this rather unique form of faster-than-light travel that he uses in the series, and it works extremely well. I was actually working with Dave way back in the early 1990s when he was first developing this idea, and I've still got a stack of his notes. You have to understand about Dave Weber. The man has to write. He has written millions of words that were never even intended for publication. But I've still got some of these. I should put them in my safe deposit box. They ought to be worth money someday. But he developed this in detail, and this is how he keeps himself honest.
That in his council.
I'm sorry?
That in his council.
True.
He has, I forget how many scientists and other people.
Yes, he's developed a real entourage of knowledgeable people.
To me, space opera doesn't necessarily have as much hard science in it. As I like to say, I was a history major for a reason. And that is that I'm terrible at math and I wasn't great at physics. Luckily for me, Jeannie's pretty good at those things. But when there's a long, and I love the Honor Harrington books, but when there's a long explanation about how we do faster than light travel, I start reading it and I get about a sentence in and I think, okay, I'm just going to figure that works. And then I skip to the end of that and keep going. So to me, space opera doesn't have to have quite as much hard science in it, but I totally agree with what Steve said, that if you put science in it, you need to follow it out logically. You can't defy the laws of physics unless you come up with something that will defy the laws of physics. And then you're kind of verging over into fantasy a little bit. But I think any kind of fiction can have shallow characters. Any kind of fiction can have a stupid plot. Any kind of fiction can be plagued by internal inconsistencies. I imagine everybody in this room has read books that fit that description. But I mean, to me, that's just, space opera to me is more Star Wars. It's not quite being so dependent on the science, but I don't mean that as dismissing the science. You have to have it, but I don't think you have to have a lengthy explanation of how you get to travel faster than light. At least that's what it means to me.
If we could backtrack just 1 second, I think really, as I said earlier, science fiction is fantasy for rationalists, and I think the purpose of all the bogus description of the faster-than-light drive goes back to the good old, much discussed willing suspension of disbelief. This is how you get rationalists to...
Oh, sure, and I'm fine with it being in there. I don't object to it. It's just that, for me, it's not necessary.
Nancy, you reminded me of an experience I had at DragonCon a number of years ago. I had been traveling, and I stopped at DragonCon on the way home. and discovered they had put me on a panel with 3 or 4 physicists. The topic was to be, how do we get faster than light travel? And of course, the answer to that is, if I knew how, I wouldn't be sitting here with these guys. One of the questions that surfaced was, how do you make a starship travel faster than light? What kind of stuff do you do in the book to persuade the reader that it works? And my response to that, which kind of, I thought, irritated everybody, both in the audience and at the table, was I pushed the button. That's it. Anything beyond, because it's like, how do you make somebody invisible? You start explaining that, you're wasting everybody's time. You have to go for a suspension of disbelief. The guy has discovered how to do it, period. Move on with the storyline. Something else, too, I think that is off that topic, but it's still on this one of the opera. I grew up, I remember my mom listening to opera on the radio when I was a kid. And, opera's a negative term. We all know that. And I think the science fiction community has made a mistake by kind of accepting the term. We bought it, and we're living with it. But it seems to me that when you're talking about good, solid science fiction, you're not really talking about science. You are talking, whatever science you've got in it, it seems to me anyway, has to be consistent with what we know about it. You can't break the rules. Because what you want is, you want the reader to be experiencing what's going on in the book. And if you start monkeying with the science, screw up the science, you take him right out of the novel, and he remembers he's sitting home in a chair somewhere. So you got to keep the science straight. But that's not what makes it work. What makes it work, it seems to me, is that whatever else is going on out there, the characters involved, particularly the viewpoint characters, the reader gets inside their minds and sees what's happening. So what you wind up with is more than simply me against the bad guys or me against the Martian invaders or whatever it is. But there have to be situations where I have to make decisions that are not easy to make. Do I, for example, get into the ship and get off the moon before it blows up and leave other people behind? Anyway, I'm sorry.
I think honestly, I have to agree with you on the idea that space opera is not meant to necessarily be a positive label that got put on it. And really it's just between two different, thought processes. It's two different groups. That there's the group that wants all the hard science, they want everything explained out, they want the mechanics of it, they want to, metaphorically stick their fingers into the technology and see how it works. And then you have the other ones that they just want to know it goes. They want to know that you're pushing the button and it goes. It's like in a story, if somebody over describes what a character is wearing, it throws the person out of the story because it's too much. I don't need all that. I just need to know they're not walking around naked. Okay? So it's just two different, thought processes, two different groups that are, one wants that hardcore and the other one wants to just go with the story. And there's nothing wrong with either one of them. And that exists in any genre there is. So, I don't know.
Okay. So we are all in agreement that while all space opera is epic science fiction, not all epic science fiction is space opera?
I think that would be a good classification.
Would you say that again?
Yeah, it depends on how you define space opera. If you define it in the usual pejorative sense, then yes, absolutely.
Okay. I asked if we are all in agreement that all space opera is epic science fiction, but not all epic science fiction is space opera.
I would probably remove the epic though. I don't know that all space opera is epic,
Right.
but it is all science fiction.
Yeah, I would agree with that, actually.
That's the only thing I would remove out of that, yeah.
Okay. The only reason I bring it up is because the description for the panel is often science fiction that is epic in nature is dismissed as space opera.
But I think that's the idea that people don't always see, that if you're not describing things out, if you're not breaking things down, if you're not creating and building and structuring things together, that it's something less. And that was the initial coining of that term. You know, that's how it got placed, and it isn't anything less just because things aren't explained out that way. You know, they're all science fiction as long as they follow the science, they stay in that core, they, you know, push you into a new thought process. It doesn't mean I have to know the inner workings of a warp core.
Well, and I think that every type of genre fiction has people who dismiss it. Who, this is just fluff, this doesn't matter. I mean, I write romance.
Don't get me started on this topic. As far as the lit crit establishment is concerned, the genre fiction can be defined as any fiction that human beings voluntarily read without either being paid to write a review of it or required to read it for academic credit. I once talked to, I live in Charlottesville, I once talked to one English department type and said, hey look, I won't even ask why you people refuse to take science fiction and fantasy seriously, but why do you refuse to take historical fiction seriously? I mean, for God's sake, War and Peace was historical fiction when it was written. And the reply was, and I remember this verbatim because I still cherish it as an example of academic pomposity. A contemporary character is the only character who can have an authentic voice. This is
Which explains why he was teaching and not writing for a living.
Oh, yeah.
But you understand both. There's a difference.
I'm not afraid to play in both.
My husband teaches children's literature, and that's been his career. He teaches children's literature in an English department. And there are so many people in the field of English literature who think those aren't real books. They're only the books that form our taste from the beginning, but what the pomposity you're talking about, those aren't real books. You know?
Well, that's all structured to the canon.
Yeah.
You know, what is perceived as classical canon is what one group has decided. You know, and that has nothing to do with the real life.
Some newspapers, I think the Atlanta Constitution is among them. I'm not sure that, I haven't read it for a few years now, so they may have changed their policy. But there are newspapers who will not review science fiction, presumably because it is minor league stuff. They will review novels about English professors try to chase students around the campus. But this other, the other stuff, go to Mars and all that's out of bounds.
Oh, but you see, these people live in an hermetically sealed world where a professor chasing the student around the campus, this is what they understand because this is the little world they live in.
I'm glad you didn't say where I go there, where I thought you were going to go with that.
You left it for the readers eventually.
Okay. And I posted these questions on a blog before I came here, so I'm actually curious. Did you, by any chance, read it, Mr. White? Because you mentioned Doc Smith. My next question was on Doc Smith.
Oh.
Of course, the next question I have is on involve War and Peace.
Hey, great minds.
He's that close to you, it's that psychic link.
Okay. Now, epic has been used to describe a lot of things in literature, Beowulf, etc. However, no one derides War and Peace for being epic, even though, as one of my professors put it, it has so many characters in it that you're happy when someone dies so you won't have to remember their name anymore. How much of the problem, and I emphasize the air quotes, how much of the problem of epic science fiction is the epic, and how much of it is that science fiction and fantasy itself has been historically looked down on as as a genre?
Well, you know, it's interesting you should mention this. A long time ago, I read one review of Heinlein's Starship Troopers, and one of the criticisms the reviewer made was that he thought it was just an outrageous coincidence that he had these characters, and as he put it, there just happened to be a war coming along at this time. Well, you know, nobody criticizes Tolstoy because his characters just happened to be born in time for the Napoleonic Wars. Look, if somebody is going to write a war story, he must be permitted a war. I just don't think this is a valid criticism.
Well, I think it's in part because most genre fiction, it's not necessarily a happy ending, but it is a triumphant ending. And there's a whole school of thought that says anything in which the heroes or the good guys prevail is just unrealistic because life's not like that. And they don't care what you put on the spine. If the book ends that way, they dismiss it.
Well, but they're the same people that'll skewer you if the hero doesn't win.
Oh, yeah. But, you know, life is grim enough. I want to read a book where everything is in the toilet at the end of the story.
I think this is one of the characteristics of epic science fiction and epic fiction generally, an underlying assumption that human effort matters.
Even if it fails, it matters.
There can be such a thing as noble failure. The Japanese are heavily into this, but failure does not equal futility.
Any other comments?
Okay, well, I will add one thing, because you mentioned Babel. It's funny to think that so much, to coin my teenager shade has been thrown on science fiction and fantasy when Babel was basically fantasy. So, okay, our first real story, written down and passed on for generations is fantasy, and yet fantasy is a lesser fiction. Science fiction is not that far off from it either, because it's the idea that you can imagine and you can create something different that perfectly fits in that world. So it's just one of those odd things.
Same thing is true of the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Oh, I know.
Absolutely.
Fantasy and probably a little bit of science fiction in there too, if you place it in a time frame. So.
Although, looking back, I'm trying to remember a single science fiction author, going back to Burroughs, even, where, okay, we've got epic scope, we've got a science fiction setting, but, again, I don't remember any of them who have been given, respect as, quote, literature.
Jules Verne.
Yeah.
Okay.
How about H.G. Wells?
Man,
Ray Bradbury.
to some extent. Yeah.
Okay, 2.5.
Mark Twain did a time travel novel for us.
Mm.
I don't know whether
Mary Shelley.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mary Shelley.
Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Pope.
But nobody considers these science fiction. You're not gonna,
That's true.
Well-
Frankenstein's going to be in the
Well,
fiction
wasn't
and
Frankenstein-
literature
yes.
section of the bookstore.
Yeah.
Frankenstein was
It's a quality work, it's
considered
not science
almost
fiction.
horror instead when it began, and then it slowly got shifted into the idea that it was science fiction. So, yeah.
Yeah.
As long as they don't classify as science fiction, you can like it.
Yeah.
You got a
well, of
chance.
course.
I can't have a
No,
pit bull
when I were
where I
11,
live.
when I were 11,
But if I call them a plot hound, I can have it.
yeah.
You just call them a mutt and you'll be all set. Well,
Bingo.
then, yeah.
When Ira Levin wrote The Boys from Brazil,
Mm.
it was nominated for the Hugo, but the publishers immediately hastened to withdraw it from consideration because this meant it was science fiction, which of course it was, but
you know, only what, 3 dozen clones of Hitler or something? Yes, and magically the Nazis discovered that about 30 years ahead of everyone else. Okay.
Oh, the Nazis discovered all sorts of things, decades, and everybody else like anti-gravity and so on.
So, now, I did discuss this with a few of my writing fellows, and the Dragon Award winner for horror, Brian Niemeyer, actually asked if there are science fiction epics, is there such a thing as science fiction romance? Any more questions?
Silver Medal Lover by Anne Slade. I mean, I think that's a science fiction movie. I mean, a teenage girl falls in love with that boy.
Give me the title again?
So the Silver Medal Lover.
Silver Metal Lover.
Yeah, it's by Anne Slade.
And McCaffrey was originally considered
Yeah, most of McCaffrey's early
basic,
stuff.
yeah, or any female author
Bradley, yeah,
in some of the earlier stuff.
I'm not sure what the definition of romance is in the literary sense, but I think some of Lois Bujold's Miles Borkosigan novels could fit into that.
And there's one actually, a civil campaign is dedicated to Dorothy, Georgette, Jane, and I can't remember the fourth one, but that's Dorothy Dunnett, Georgette Hayer, and Jane Austen. So, yeah, and the Borkosigans are great. I love those books. But there's a whole group of women within the Romance Writers of America who write science fiction romance. I'm pretty sure most of it is not hard science fiction. I don't read a lot of it because when you're reading a romance, at least in RWA circles, the definition is one couple, although sometimes people do ménage, and you know, that's fine, but it has to be happy for now or happily ever after. If it doesn't have that, it can be a wide range of things, but it's not a romance. And so that's what people who read a book that says romance on the spine are reading for. They're reading for the emotion, not the world building.
I've never heard that definition.
Well, you're not an RWA member, I assume. So it's, but conversely, not everybody who writes that science fiction romance goes light on the world building, but a lot of people do. Because, I mean, one of the joys for me of writing fantasy and now dipping into space opera is I can do all this great stuff with the world. I mean, when I did my third paranormal romance for Hachette, the ghouls are harvesting livers, and the hero is a mage doctor. And I thought, okay, well, I came up with this idea. Now I need a reason they would be harvesting livers. And there's a guy in Charlotte who knows my husband who's a nationally recognized authority on the liver. And he sat down with me for an hour and a half, and I got to take notes. And it was awesome. I was totally geeking out on it, and he gave me the perfect stuff. And so I came up with this device that my mage doctor would use to kind of test people's magic potential, because the people whose livers are getting harvested have magic potential. And I was so proud of it, and I was so happy with it, and I sent it in, and my editor went, "We're going to have to take all this out." And I'm like, "What?" She said, "It's too many pages of just world building that don't have anything to do with the romance, and it's like Elmore Leonard says, leave out the parts people skip, and romance readers will skip that." And that's why I dip my toe in different pools, because I like writing the relationship stuff focused in the romance, but I like writing the more intricate world. And so that's a really long way of kind of explaining that yes, people do write science fiction romance, but and I totally, you know, it's late. I totally forgot where I was going with that.
Well, a good example of what two things y'all have brought up is Nora Roberts, who is one of the top-selling romance authors, who writes science fiction as J.D. Robb, has 26 books in the series as of last month, but put it out because, is it more than 26? I thought the 26th one was last month.
Yeah, it's by the 40s number.
I've actually seen her, or someone.
But yeah, I have too. She's great. But the thing is, when she started doing it, they wouldn't let her publish her science fiction ideas under her own name. Her publisher said no, and that's why she used the pseudonym. It was the same idea as, oh, we can't nominate that for you. Go no.
Well, honestly, what it comes down to is we're classifying books under specific genres just so that the bookstores know where to put them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really all it is at this point.
I've heard people describe Ted Sturgeon as a romance writer because every story he writes is ultimately about love.
Okay.
Which I think shows how mushy the distinctions between these genres are. They tend to overlap.
Mm-hmm.
Is he the one who also said all money flows to the writer? It's somebody's law, and I thought it was Sturgeon's law.
Sturgeon's law actually is 90% of everything that's out.
correct.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. We go until the 50-minute mark, right? Okay. I expected we have more time for questions from the audience, but we've got 5 minutes, so if anybody's got a question, or have we beaten this horse to death?
So back on the previous topic about it's not really science fiction, isn't really literature, there were a couple books by Mary Doria Russell. I can't for the life of me remember the name, but it was a classic first contact story with Jesuits.
Yes.
I got into a conversation with somebody who swore up and down they were not science fiction.
I would be inclined to agree simply because the science was.
They weren't epic and they weren't great science, but it was a classic first contact story. So they lost me on the it can't be science fiction, it's literature.
Well, it's like I was saying earlier about the willing suspension of disbelief.
Yeah.
Now, I'm easy as far as that goes. I mean, considering how much science fiction I read, obviously, it doesn't take much to get me to willingly suspend disbelief. But the books you're talking about, no, I do have no limits.
Okay. Yes?
Just wanted to comment that I remember reading an article about what space opera was in some magazine, and they argued that Star Wars would be space opera and Dune would be space opera, right? But something like the Foundation series isn't, and I think that goes to your distinction between hard science, right? Like,
Well, that is.
Foundation series is such hard science that people who don't like that stop reading it.
Yeah.
Because they spend an entire chapter on how you have to recalculate every time you make a jump, and you gotta spend 30 days looking at the stars before you go anywhere, right?
Yeah, something my husband would love and would bore me to
But
tears.
I didn't find it pejorative about space opera. My understanding was that it's like an opera with the fat lady singing. You're talking about grand sweeping events that are people screaming at the top of their lungs about what's going on, right?
But you can have grand sweeping events in just hard science fiction too. I mean, I feel like a lot of times they brand things
Well, I
space
think that's
opera
why it
because
could
of
be
the
epic, though.
romantic aspects and that specific kind of flow of the story.
Well, there's a difference between Foundation that has the entire civilized universe at stake versus the Harkonnens and the Atreides. That's opera, right?
Yeah.
That's love and jealousy and.
The one thing it was not was hard science fiction.
Okay. Any other questions from the audience? Okay. So, we've got 2 minutes. Any final thoughts?
Come buy our books.
And
Okay.
actually
I
have
have
sample chapters.
one last question, if they're gonna tie it up. Can each of them tell us what they're working on right now?
I'm working on a novel entitled Her Majesty's American, which is set in an alternate history in which the American Revolution got patched up, and as a result in the 23rd century, which is when this is taking place, there's an interstellar British Empire. It's still called that, although in fact the power centers by then are in North America and India. But we've still got some irreconcilable people running around. Basically, it's an alternate history, science fiction, spy story.
I'm working on, this is a 2-novella anthology, and so I'm working on the second novella. We decided to do a Christmas in Space anthology, so I'm writing my Christmas story. And the sequel to this book takes place in the 100 days between Napoleon's escape from Elba and the Battle of Waterloo. And so that's not a period I've really delved into a lot, so I'm doing the research for that. And that's kind of got me on a full plate right now. And then we're editing this to get it ready to come out this summer.
I'm working on The Long Sunset, which is a Priscilla Hutchins novel. That's set about 200 years from now. Priscilla, they're trying to shut down interstellar travel altogether because a lot of people feel it's dangerous. A lot of scientists feel it's dangerous. Priscilla's on the last mission that goes out, or what is to be the last mission. And they are wandering around, and actually they're trying to respond to a signal that was intercepted from 7,000 light years away. And during the course of looking into that, they discover an inhabited world, an ocean world that's mostly islands. There's some aliens on a beach, and the vehicle that Priscilla's riding it kind of breaks down. And so there were some problems with the. Well, you don't care about that. But anyway, it breaks down, and she could have landed on the beach, but there were a lot of these aliens on the beach, so she crashes in the ocean, which is going to leave them completely stranded with no chance at all apparently of getting home. But the aliens turned out to be very friendly, and they're very pleased because they recognize what she did. And they have a church, a temple really, with a large globe on top. There's a point in it where one of Priscilla's people asks the guy who runs the temple, "What does the globe stand for?" And he says, "We're all in it together." Now these people don't have much in the way of technology, but they also have a black hole coming in, and that black hole's going to be there in 60 years. So you can figure where it goes from there.
I just finished a short story for the Four Horsemen's universe, Information Overload. I actually really liked writing the characters, so that's where I started to kind of delve off into this idea of a female protagonist character that is military pilot of space with the different aspects of the universes. And I also have a short story that I'm looking at that is a colonization on another planet, but it's like when we colonized Australia with convicts. It's the same idea. We send them away with this small little bit that they can survive and see what happens. So.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming. And buy their books.
Oh, I have sample chapters in the freebie rack downstairs for both of these, so if you want to check those out.
I'll be selling my books
grab them.
tomorrow down at the
I have a signing, by the way, tomorrow at noon in the